They expected you to be slow, illiterate, unaware, powerless. The guards didn't flinch when you were marched into the camp, just another captured American, black-skinned and battle-worn, shackled by both war and the times. They looked you over like livestock, ranked you below themselves, not by merit, not by experience, not by what you knew or what you'd done, but by the color of your skin. In their eyes, that was enough. That told them everything they needed to know, or so they thought. To them, you were less than a soldier. You were an anomaly because the propaganda told them that no man with skin like yours could truly be a threat. You weren't supposed to fight well. You weren't supposed to shoot straight. You weren't supposed to speak their language. And then you did. Fluent German. Clear, confident, no hesitation. The guard's face twisted. Confusion, then disbelief. He stammered, asked again. Maybe he misunderstood. Maybe someone else said it. But then you answered. Again, in German. Then in French. And just for good measure, flawless English with a degree of academic precision that sounded like it came from the halls of Yale or Howard, not a battlefield in Europe. And that's when the cracks began to form. The first crack in the myth they'd been fed since childhood. The lie that black men were primitive, that you lacked intelligence, that you were subhuman. But there you were, calm, educated, aware, quoting Goethe, citing German military law, correcting their grammar. They didn't know what to do with that. The young ones, barely men themselves, who had grown up swallowing the doctrines of Aryan supremacy like medicine, they started to flinch when you spoke, not out of fear, but confusion. They were told you were inferior, but nothing about you felt that way. You knew their laws better than they did. You could recite the Geneva Convention line by line, article by article. You even corrected a sergeant when he misquoted a section on prisoner treatment. That shut him up. You were supposed to be dumb, but you weren't. You were supposed to be grateful for scraps, but you weren't. You were supposed to shrink, but you stood tall. That wasn't supposed to happen. Some of the guards took it as defiance. Others saw it as impossible, a mistake, a glitch in their worldview. How could you, an American Negro, know their history, their culture, their language? How could you discuss Kant and Schopenhauer with more clarity than the men who wore swastikas on their arms? Because you were never what they thought you were. You'd been a student, a teacher, a mechanic, an engineer, a linguist, a radio technician, a man who'd spent nights learning calculus while being told you could never be more than a janitor. But war has a funny way of tearing masks off systems, stripping them down to the raw truth. And the truth was, this Nazi ideology was paper thin when placed next to lived human reality. Your mind was the blade that tore through it. Some of your fellow prisoners were Tuskegee Airmen pilots trained in physics and aerodynamics. Some were engineers who could strip down a Panzer tank in less than an hour. Some were school teachers from Harlem who spoke German better than the guards. One of them once broke into a philosophical debate with a Nazi lieutenant, quoting Goethe's Faust in its original language, then switching mid-sentence into perfect French. The lieutenant walked away, said nothing. But his silence said everything. You weren't just surviving. You were disrupting. You were living proof that their ideology was a lie. You were the ghost in their machine. Some of the older guards clung tighter to doctrine. It was the only way they could sleep at night. They spat racial slurs with more venom, beat men harder, barked orders more violently, because it was the only power they had left. But others hesitated. They looked at you longer, wondered. The indoctrination was cracking, and behind it, doubt. They watched how you treated other prisoners, white ones, saw that you bore no hatred, just resolve, just a quiet dignity they hadn't expected. That shook them. One guard asked where you learned German. You said you'd studied it in college. His face twitched. He hadn't even finished school. Another caught you helping repair a damaged engine in the labor camp. He asked how you knew how it worked. You told him you were trained in Detroit helping build airplane engines long before you'd been drafted. He didn't respond. Just watched your hands. It didn't compute. They thought they were the master race. And here you were, smarter, faster, more capable, more disciplined than most of them. It rattled them. They didn't see resistance in fists or fire. They saw it in words, in memory, in presence. The very fact of your survival, your intelligence, your patience, was an act of defiance. And over time, they saw you not as a prisoner but as a problem. Because you weren't just a captive, you were a mirror. And that mirror reflected everything they didn't want to admit. Some of them started asking questions. Whispered ones, questions they weren't supposed to ask. One young soldier, maybe 19, asked if America really let black men vote. You told him no, not really. You told him you were fighting a war overseas for freedoms you didn't even have at home. He didn't know what to say to that. It shattered him more than anything else. You, a soldier of democracy, stripped of rights in the land you fought for, yet somehow still carried yourself with more honor than those who held the keys. That irony burned deep. Some guards took your knowledge as a threat. You were isolated, punished, beaten, moved from camp to silence you. But your silence screamed louder than their guns ever could. And still you endured. There were stores covert acts of resistance, sabotaging equipment, Amias translating orders to buy time for other prisoners, sharing coded information. One man even fed false information to a guard who trusted him, leading to delays in operations. They never suspected him after all. What could a black man possibly know about battlefield logistics? Everything, as it turns out. Because knowledge was your weapon. Precision was your blade. Dignity was your armor. They couldn't strip that away. And when the war ended, when the gates of those camps swung open and the swastikas came down, you stepped out not as a victim, but as a contradiction. A living repudiation of everything they believed. But then came the return. Not to celebration, not to parades, but to buses with colored-only signs. To schools you couldn't attend. To jobs you couldn't get. To neighborhoods where your uniform meant nothing. The country you fought for had no intention of seeing what the enemy had been forced to recognize. You were brilliant, capable, equal, and still, America looked away. That, perhaps, was the cruelest irony of all. You dismantled Nazi ideology not with weapons, but with intellect. You'd shattered the myth of racial superiority by standing tall in the shadow of its most violent form. And yet your own homeland refused to see what even the enemy could no longer deny. But the truth doesn't vanish. The truth, once seen, spreads. Some of those guards long after the war spoke about the black prisoners who changed their minds. Quietly, ashamed, admitting that they were wrong. That everything they were taught was a lie. They remembered you, not because you begged, not because you broke, but because you stood, you spoke, you knew. And they had nothing to stand on in the face of that. You didn't just survive. You educated, you resisted, you existed, and that was enough to shake a regime built on delusion. You were never supposed to be more than a statistic, a footnote, a forgotten face in the march of history, but instead, you became the very proof that truth when spoken clearly can be more powerful than any gun, any wall, any doctrine. They tried to bury you under ignorance, but you spoke, and that above all is what they will remember. They thought the uniform on your back was borrowed, as if you'd stolen it. As if it didn't belong to you. An imitation soldier, that's how they saw you. A prop in someone else's war. Wearing the stars and stripes like a costume because in their world, men like you weren't supposed to fight for freedom, much less understand it. But you weren't playing dress up. You'd earned every thread, every stripe, every medal, every scar. You weren't pretending to be a soldier. You were one. They figured you'd break in days. Maybe weeks. They counted on it. Thought they knew what pressure did to men like you. Thought you'd fold like paper when the food ran thin and the days turned long and the cold came in through the stone walls. But you didn't fold. You adapted. Because breaking wasn't new to you. You'd been resisting since birth. Jim Crow was your drill instructor. Segregation was your boot camp. You'd already been trained for adversity long before the army ever gave you a rifle. You'd grown up learning how to speak two languages, English and survival. How to stay quiet in a loud room. How to carry anger without showing it. How to be smarter than they expected, and quieter than they wanted. You knew what it meant to walk a tightrope with dignity while carrying the weight of an entire world that didn't see your humanity. So, no, a POW camp didn't break you. It reminded you of home. Different flag, same chain. And yet, somehow, you still believed in something more. Something better. The white prisoners noticed it, too. They came in wounded, bleeding, scared. Some looked at you with suspicion. Some didn't know what to make of a black man in the same uniform, sitting beside them in the same dirt, eating the same rations. And yet you treated them with respect, not because they earned it, not because they gave it, but because you were a soldier, because you had honor, even when they didn't. One night, one of them asked why. Why would you fight for a country that treats you like you don't belong? You didn't yell. You didn't curse. You just said, because I do belong, whether it sees me or not. And that silence that followed. It wasn't just respect. It was shame. Because deep down, they knew you'd proven something they never could. You were fighting two wars, one against fascism, and one against the lie that a man's worth is written in his skin. And somehow, even in chains, you were winning both. The German officers took notes. Some thought they were studying you, monitoring your movements, your morale, your behavior. But in truth, you were studying them. You watched the shifts in their posture when you walked into a room. You caught the hesitation when you spoke fluent German in front of the other prisoners. You saw the way their eyes darted around when you quoted Goethe or argued about the Treaty of Versailles like a scholar. You noticed the younger ones, especially the ones who had been raised entirely under Nazi indoctrination. You saw the questions forming behind their eyes, because you weren't supposed to exist. But there you were, educated, articulate, tactical, unbroken. You were a walking contradiction to every page of Mein Kampf. A few tried to dismiss you, called you an anomaly, a trick, a puppet of some Jewish conspiracy. They told themselves anything to avoid facing what was right in front of them. That their ideology didn't stand a chance against human truth. The day the senior camp guard was publicly corrected by one of your fellow POWs, a black lieutenant from New Jersey fluent in 4 languages, was the day things started to shift. He misquoted a rule from the Hague Convention, said the prisoners had no right to extra blankets in winter. That lieutenant stepped forward, calm and precise, and quoted the exact passage from memory in German, verbatim. The guard turned red, didn't speak for a moment, then told him to shut up and sit down. But the damage was done. A few of the German soldiers started looking sideways at each other. They had no answer. The Nazi war machine ran on dehumanization. It needed it like fuel. The idea that one race was superior to another wasn't just rhetoric, it was the foundation of everything they did. And here you were, a fault line in that foundation. Some guards grew angry. They punished harder. Rations got tighter. Beatings more frequent. One officer requested the black prisoners be isolated, called you morale poison, said your very presence was a threat to order. He was right, because you weren't just surviving, you were inspiring. Other post-white, disillusioned, began leaning on you, learning from you, asking questions they'd never dared voice back home. How many books had you read? Where had you gone to school? Was it true you'd studied law? Yes, it was true. You'd read Plato before the war. You'd memorized Baldwin. You'd taken classes in chemistry, architecture, literature. Some of your brothers in arms had helped build bridges, invent engines, fly planes. And still, back home, you had to sit in the back of the bus. That truth was too much for some. It made them question the very soil under their feet. Even some of your captors couldn't hide the conflict. They'd been taught to expect an animal. And instead, they found a professor. It wasn't just what you said. It was how you said it. Calm, controlled, fierce without raising your voice. You turned interrogation into education. You made survival into subversion. And you never raised a fist. Because you didn't need to. You had something more dangerous than defiance. You had clarity. Every day you remained dignified in chains. The lie of racial superiority lost another inch of ground. One guard, an old man who had served in World War I, stopped you one morning and asked, "Why do you not hate me?" You paused. Then you said, "Because if I do, I become what you think I am." He never asked again. And when the Allies finally came, when the American tanks rolled in and the barbed wire fences came down, you didn't cheer. You watched, because you knew what was coming. Liberation didn't mean equality. Not for you. The white soldiers were greeted with fanfare, with homecoming parades and headlines. You returned to a country that barely acknowledged your sacrifice. You went back to towns where you couldn't vote, drink from the same fountain, or even enter the front door of the same building you helped defend. They told you to be grateful. Grateful to be free. Grateful to be alive. Grateful for the chance to stand silently while others took credit for the fight you helped win. But you weren't looking for credit. You were looking for truth. And the truth was this: you hadn't just fought a war overseas. You'd fought one in every stare, every insult, every silence. And you'd won. Not with bombs, but with presence. You stood in the belly of the beast and revealed the lie at its heart. You walked into the myth of supremacy and cracked it open, not with rage, but with brilliance, with restraint, with fluency, with fire in your mind instead of your hands. And now, decades later, they try to forget, try to rewrite, try to bury your story under layers of polished patriotism and selective memory. But history remembers, even if the headlines didn't, even if the textbooks skip the chapter, even if the monuments leave your name off the list. We remember, because you weren't just a prisoner. You were a witness. You were a mirror. You were a test, one that Nazi ideology failed again and again. And in a world built on lies, simply being yourself was the most powerful resistance of all. They called it survival, but that wasn't the word for it. What you did wasn't just surviving. It was enduring, outlasting, withstanding not just the cold, the hunger, the backbreaking labor, but the weight of being misjudged every single day. You didn't just survive their camps. You survived their stares, their laughter, their condescension, The thousand tiny humiliations they thought you wouldn't notice. But you noticed. You remembered every time they assumed you couldn't read. Every time they chuckled when you picked up a book. Every time they spoke German in front of you like you were deaf to the words. You weren't deaf. You were just listening. You took everything they thought they knew and you turned it on its head. They thought you were dangerous because you were different. Carried him. That guard stood silent, hands shaking slightly, as he lit a cigarette and watched the scene. Something shifted in his face. A crack. A fracture in the rigid mask he'd worn since the war began. He didn't say a word, but he looked at you differently after that. That's the part no one talks about. The quiet resistance. Not in riots or uprisings, but in presence. In the way you made their uniforms look small just by standing tall. In the way your voice steady, fluent, direct left no room for pity. In the way you carried your pain with discipline, not despair. And when the war ended, and the world woke up from its fever dream of flags and fire, there were German men who couldn't forget what they saw. They couldn't erase the image of the black soldier who quoted their poets better than they could. The man who understood their laws. The prisoner who fixed their trucks, spoke their tongue, and knew their history better than they did. The man who never cursed them, even when they earned it. That man haunted them. Because he proved something too dangerous to speak out loud. That the foundations of their beliefs, the racial ladder, the genetic myths, the arrogance they'd been raised on were sand. And still, you came home, not to parades or medals, but to the back door of the bus, to job offers that vanished when they saw your face, to schools that said not here, to laws that whispered you don't count. But you already knew what the world tried to forget. You knew what you were made of. You'd looked the ugliest kind of hatred in the eye and didn't blink. You'd carried your dignity into a cage and walked out of it taller than when you entered. If you enjoyed this, tap like, subscribe, and share. It tells the algorithm that this content matters, and it helps us keep creating more.